First of all, welcome everyone. Today, hopefully, is the 6th of April and it's 9:05. We've got Marcus with us. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
It's really nice for you to join us. And in fact, while I sort out my slight sound problem, I'm going to hand over everything to you, Marcus. And the topic of today, or certainly the first topic, is Brexit. If perhaps you'll give us a background as to how we've got to where we are today, what is actually happening, what impact it has, not just in the UK, but in Europe as a whole, and also what your predictions are.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So I think this is a moment then, while Richard sorts things out, to take stock as to where we are. We were originally due to leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019 at 11 p.m, which was exactly 2 years after Article 50 was triggered. An extension to Article 50 was requested until June, some weeks ago, when it became clear that Theresa May was having significant difficulty getting her deal through the House of Commons. She'd had 2 attempts at that stage. She tried a third after the extension, but she requested an extension, and she wanted an extension until June. But the EU came back, and the EU said you can only have an extension until the 22nd of May if and only if it was for time to implement Theresa May's deal. And if her deal could not get through the House of Commons, that leaving date would be the 12th of April. In other words, this coming Friday. She then had one more attempt at getting it through the House of Commons, and it failed, not by the record levels we saw in the first 2 attempts, but by a much smaller margin of 50 or so votes. What I would say at this point is that getting that extension was not as straightforward as many people predicted. And I gave radio interviews around about that time, which are available now on Illuminati Silver. And I warned that getting an extension from the EU would not be straightforward because it required the consent of all 27 EU member states. Getting the EU to agree on anything these days seems to be very difficult because the makeup of the governments in different parts of the EU are very different indeed. We are seeing more anti-establishment governments appearing, anti-establishment in different forms. And that goes from Macron in France on one sense, to Conte in Italy, to Orban in Hungary. And as distasteful as I find Orban, he is anti-EU. He's not a friend of the EU establishment. Conte in Italy, similar thing. I'm not as hostile to him as I am to Orban, but these are anti-EU establishment governments, and getting that agreement as to how long the extension should be for was not easy. And in the end, they came up with this compromise of 22nd of May to get the deal, if the deal had been ratified, to time to implement it, April the 12th if it could not be get through the House of Commons. So it didn't get through the House of Commons. And then we moved on then to last Monday, where effectively the phrase that was used was the House of Commons took control of the process with a series of what were known as indicative votes. And unusually for the House of Commons, they normally, for those of you not familiar with how the British House of Commons works, if there's a division bell, you get out of your seat and you walk through one of 2 divisional lobbies. On this occasion, you were given a ballot paper and you effectively had to put yes or no, or aye or nay, to use the House of Commons expressions, against each of the available options. And they ranged from revoking Article 50 to a second referendum to, well, there were a number of options, a customs union, something called Norway Plus. And then the vote took place, and it took them an hour or so to tot up the counts for all the different ones. And the end result was that every single one of the proposals was voted down and was rejected. So the indicative votes got us absolutely nowhere. There was actually quite a funny speech from somebody in the European Parliament towards the end of the week. I think the Americans are familiar with Monty Python, and he compared it to a famous Monty Python sketch. So the House of Commons has said it doesn't want to leave with no deal, doesn't want to revoke Article 50, doesn't want a customs union, doesn't want the second referendum. You're telling us what you don't want. You're not telling us what you do want. And this is that the House of Commons is often referred to as the mother of all parliaments. It's a global laughingstock at the moment, quite frankly. So then we moved on to Wednesday, and Wednesday evening was pretty significant as well, because Well, late afternoon, there was a vote on whether to hold more indicative votes this coming Monday. Please bear with me on this. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll explain it as simply as I can. And for the first time since 1993, we had a tied vote. It was 310, 310. And under those circumstances, the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, effectively had the casting vote, and he had to follow precedent on that. And the precedent dictated that he would say, after vote no. He wasn't obliged to, but he followed precedent and he correctly voted no. So no indicative votes this coming Monday. But then something happened later in the day, and this concerned me greatly. An MP called Yvette Cooper on the Labour side teamed up with a Conservative called Oliver Letwin to pass an amendment which meant that effectively it obliged Theresa May to ask for a further extension and also expressed a will not to leave with no deal this coming Friday. Now, normally to get a bill through the House of Commons, there's a first reading, a second reading, and a third reading. And in between, it goes to committee stage and it goes to the House of Lords. I can't think of an example in my lifetime where it's been pushed through in one day. It takes many days, usually many weeks or months. It can take several years in some cases, but to push it through in one day is, I would describe it quite strongly, actually. I would describe it as constitutional vandalism. And I don't use that lightly, but it happened, and it's now in the House of Lords, and it was debated in the House of Lords on Friday. And there's a procedure, I don't know if the Americans use this expression, called filibustering, where you just talk and talk and talk to try and time out a bill. And there were attempts to do that, but it does look as though it's making progress in the House of Lords, and it's rubber stamping it. That could happen as soon as Monday. But anyway, maybe it's not quite as relevant in itself as it seems, because Theresa May has written a letter to request an extension of Article 50 anyway. And she's requesting it until June. Now, that is the last possible date by which she can request an extension in itself, because even a day beyond what she's requested would require there to be UK representatives in the EU Parliament. Now, the elections take place in May, but they don't actually take their seats till the middle of June. And it would leave the EU in a constitutionally awkward position if the UK was a member of the EU for a day longer than that without representation in the European Parliament.
Marcus, if I can stop you there. So what you're saying is that you could have a scenario whereby the British may actually have to take part in the elections, but then may only sit there for one day. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying I think that's going to happen. What I am saying is that if Theresa May gets her extension to that June date, which she is requesting, which, by the way, I don't think she will necessarily get, then that will be an absolute cutoff point. Because if we are there a day longer than that, there will legally have to be British representation in the European Parliament. And if those elections hadn't take place, then where does that leave us? Now, the EU will be aware of that. Which then leaves it, the only other option really would be revoking Article 50. Now, I read something in yesterday's Financial Times by a journalist called David Green, and that's actually far more legally complicated than you might think. It's not just a case of putting a bill through the House of Commons. And David Green outlined why in this article. And from the EU's point of view, from EU law's point of view, it's in the gift of the British executive, not the British Parliament, to write that letter to say we are revoking Article 50. And the implications of doing that would be huge. And there are grey areas. There would inevitably be legal challenges. So what I would say in conclusion is that we are, in a sense, I'm not saying this will happen, but we are closer to leaving the EU without a deal this coming Friday than most people realize. And to summarize my reasons for that very briefly, all EU states would have to agree to the extension to June, including the Contes and the Orbans of this world. And that has implications in all sorts of ways, not least it's the last possible date without UK representation in the European Parliament. We would have to leave by then if we committed to doing so. And we should also be mindful that an extension might not be offered at all. It would be absolute if it is offered to June. And we've got Donald Tusk, one of the EU presidents, one of 5 EU presidents, He's put an offer of a year-long extension, which we could leave at any time as soon as it's ratified. That doesn't seem to have gone down too well with even the high-profile people like Macron, let alone the less well-known EU leaders. And as I've just mentioned, revoking Article 50 is legally complex. It's not something you could do by next Friday in an absolute way. It's probably not even possible to do that this year, looking at what David Green wrote in his article. And doing so would, let's be clear about this, it would risk social disorder more so than those inside the Westminster bubble understand. And meanwhile, while all this is going on, Theresa May is holding talks with Jeremy Corbyn. I would have approached the whole Brexit process in a very different way. And at the same time, on Friday, the Democratic Unionist Party, who are propping up Theresa May's government, they wrote quite a terse 4-paragraph statement. And she made it clear that she's not happy with the compromises, the red lines disappearing, because the DUP are Eurosceptic. They're not happy with her even holding these talks with Jeremy Corbyn and giving up her red lines in effect. You know what? When Brexit happened, and when the Brexit result happened in June 2016, some friends of mine who've known me for years, they said to me as a joke, they said, "Oh, what are you going to do now? We're leaving the EU. You've been going on and on about it for years. Are you going to get married and have children? Ha, ha, ha." And I looked at them in the eye, stony faced, and I said, "We haven't left yet." And they said, what do you mean? What do you mean we haven't left yet? You don't think they're going to try and stop it? And I said, I think the political establishment will try every trick in the book to frustrate, delay, and preferably block Brexit. And that is exactly what has happened.
I would agree with you entirely, Marcus, on all of that. But one thing to clarify, the reason for Britain having to vote and be in the Parliament isn't just a matter of technicality. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So when Britain announced it was giving up 73 seats in the Parliament, the European Parliament, which is a bit of a farce to call it a parliament, because it doesn't debate anything, they just make set-piece 2-minute speeches to camera to play on television in Britain so that they get re-elected. They vote for hundreds of items in one after another on a Friday morning, and it is a complete farce as a parliament. There is nothing diplomatic about it, or no element of democracy in it. But when it was heard that 73 seats were being given up by Britain, all the other countries climbed in and said they wanted extra seats. Britain's 73 seats have now been apportioned to other people, because you couldn't possibly have a parliament or a congress or any other government body see itself getting smaller. They're in the business of empire building, which means getting bigger. So there's the added problem that if we do join in the elections, other countries will have between them 73 less MEPs, members of the European Parliament, to elect. If we don't join in, it'll be too late, because they'll have been apportioned to other countries. So this just adds to the complete farce that is going on at the moment. Meanwhile, one thing that has been established is that effectively Parliament is completely and utterly irrelevant to anything. It doesn't do what its job is, which is to represent the people. And it has just spent 2 years spending immense amounts of time on hot air and committees about Brexit and the various ramifications. Meanwhile, they haven't been able to do their main job, which is running the country, mainly because they are such a low-grade bunch of clowns after nearly 50 years of Britain being run as a vassal state of a centralized bureaucracy in Brussels. which really doesn't want to hear from us, except when we're asked to send them money, they're now demanding that if we do drop out with no deal, we still have to pay 39 billion to keep them afloat. I can't think why.
Do both of you, I'm interested in both your thoughts on this from both of you. Do you think that the EU is running out of patience with this country? Because a lot of people were saying when Theresa May requested her first extension that, oh, this would be a formality. And I warned against that at the time. And what we saw was a conditional extension, one to May to ratify Theresa May's deal, and one till next Friday without her deal. I don't think that getting this extension that she has now requested, the letter she put in yesterday, is going to be straightforward at all. And I'm interested in both of your thoughts on this.
Well, firstly, I'm hoping that they turn it down flat and say out on Friday. I'm not sure that they'll have the courage to do that, because that will suddenly leave them short of money, desperately short of money, because the European Union is dependent on spending more and more and more money. And Britain as a net contributor, don't forget, we pay billions a year. And everyone says, but you get money back. Well, that is really, when you look at it closely, complete nonsense. We give them the money, and they deign to give some back to us, telling us what we can spend it on, and all too often expecting us to match the amount of money that they give us, called matched funding. So as a result, it's just a huge Ponzi scheme where they have to keep on growing and having more money sucked into the middle to give out in what is little more than bribes, because you could hardly call an MEP's job as worth a salary. Now, they are merely upholding what the Central Committee of unelected bureaucrats decides to do.
Greg,
yes, I think they are getting very bored with Britain and the analysis of their scam. And as a result of this analysis, it is becoming more and more transparent that it is little more than a scam. So yes, they want to be shot of us to silence that, but no, they want to hang on to us because we're the milk cow that's keeping it afloat.
Right, if I can, before I answer that question, Marcus, may I ask all those who are online, please, by all means, put forward any questions you have, but can you give me a thumbs up? Because since 9:04, I've had no conversation from you. And if you can just give me a thumbs up to make sure that you are actually online and can hear what we're discussing, please.
And the Brexit hasn't put you all to sleep.
Because I'm a trifle concerned that I have people showing in the live chat, but I have no comments at all, and that's not usual. So may I ask everyone who's listening to give us a thumbs up, please, just so that I know that you're there. Okay, good. Excellent. Right. I was a little worried there. Okay. EU equals Fourth Reich, says Bowman. Marcus, just to answer that as directly as I can, they are fed up. They've achieved one goal insofar that they've shown the other countries in the EU that it's not easy to get out. And if you do want to get out, it's going to be very costly. One of the concerns, as you know, the commissioners had was that if our departure from the EU was seen as a somewhat easy activity, their greatest fear is that other countries would follow suit. At the moment, there is no agreement. They're playing hardball with us, and therefore they've achieved a goal. Having said that, Greg has quite rightly stipulated they don't want to lose our contributions because we are one of only a handful of countries that are net contributors to the EU. And when we go, then the onus then falls onto Germany, to an extent to France, and also to Italy. And they can least afford, really, in view of the fact that their GDPs are collapsing, they can least afford to put even more money in to support the other economies of the EU that are failing even worse. But I have a question for you two gentlemen, and that is, this past week, we have basically seen the value of the value of sterling versus the dollar, the value of the euro versus the dollar, remain more or less the same. Now, with all of this uncertainty, I would have expected sterling to have fallen, but it hasn't. Do you have a take on this? In other words, there's virtually no change between now sterling, euro, and the US dollar in terms of their interrelationship. And that, of course, to those who follow these things, know that that impacts then the price of gold and silver. So
Richard, I don't think that anybody who has watched money markets at all countenances anything that's going on nowadays, bearing in mind that effectively all major world currencies are worthless. It is only what people are prepared to trade them for. America has more debt than it has asset in financial terms. So does Britain. So do almost all countries. Net result, I think the days of large swings in currencies have gone. We've moved more onto modern money management, where we've agreed an amount and certain countries can print as much as is required as a lending commodity to other people to be the reserve currencies. It is why, in my opinion, they bombed Iraq flat. It was because Iraq and Iran were about to collude in setting up a spot market for oil that would trade in a currency other than dollars. And China had agreed to buy through it. It's why they bombed Libya and murdered Gaddafi. One of the longest serving head of state, who had led an increasingly stable country that had an incredible educational standard that he'd taken over and built from the 28, I think it was, tribes that his father had ruled. And there was absolutely no justification for doing that, except that he was about to launch the gold dinar in collusion with Egypt and Saudi and various smaller Middle Eastern countries. And he was going to use it as the reserve currency of choice of the whole of Africa and the Middle East.
But Greg, to be frank with you, to some extent, the world has moved to this modern monetary theory, whereby if your country is large enough and dominant enough, such as the United States, to a degree Europe, then they can keep printing almost indefinitely until someone calls a halt. Now,
so it's in nobody's interest to dip one of those countries too greatly.
No, absolutely. And what's clearly happening, I mean, Cabadesia's just put up, all fiat is circling the drain. It is. But the question is going to be, when will it actually, all of it fall down through the drain? And of course, currency values are interrelated. it doesn't matter if the dollar goes down technically, as long as the other currencies go down, or if the dollar goes up, as long as the other currencies go up. So there is a degree of comparative evaluation. Now, I have long argued against those, such as Peter Schiff and some of the others, who say the dollar's going to collapse tomorrow or next week or next month or even next year. And they've been saying that since 2008, because the dollar is still the hegemonic currency throughout the world. And other currencies will fail first, almost. Now, I'm saying almost, not quite. It's almost irrelevant how much debt they incur, because they are the world producers of that currency. And as long as they can keep shipping it out to other countries, then they're okay. The problems, of course, ultimately will be when that currency comes back to their country and then floods their marketplace, which is why they're always looking for new countries to take on dollar-denominated debt. So I would certainly see the euro collapsing long before I see the dollar collapsing, which is what is giving the dollar its current strength. You've got a dollar index now at 97. People were predicting it would go down to 90 after the Fed declared that it was no longer going to raise interest rates. And that's not what we've seen, because every other country is also now embarking either on QE or no quantitative tightening. Now, I've got here, I want to run through this quickly because we've got some questions. Cabadej and Marcus, I will come back to you on the economic front.
Okay.
But Cabadej has said there was supposed to be another referendum which would be rigged to stay in. She's also said, I hear Saudi has been selling oil in yuan since November. And I hear China owns all the ports in Canada, Mexico, and now the Panama Canal, plus, of course, Greek ports. The jig is about up, and the West is self-destructing into a third world. And Bowman agrees with Cabadej. If you listen closely, you can hear the cornerstone of Western civilization starting to fracture. So, Marcus, do you want to comment on any of that or all of it, please?
Yes, I go back to this question about a second referendum, and this has been touted almost within a day or two of the result of the first one coming through. The rather vocal Labour MP David Lammy was calling for it within 24 hours of the Leave vote coming through. What we have seen, for those of you who don't follow EU politics particularly closely, the history of the last 40-odd years across the EU has been of countries being given referenda. And if people vote against what the EU wants, they keep being asked to vote again and again and again until they get the correct answer. And we've seen this, particularly in countries like Ireland, where there's a constitutional requirement for them to have a referendum every time a new EU treaty comes out. So whether it was the Maastricht Treaty, Lisbon, Nice, Amsterdam, every time that happened, Ireland was asked to vote on it. And on a number of occasions, Ireland voted no. And what happens is the political establishment in Ireland, which is all pro-EU, the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, the leading parties in Ireland, whichever one is in government at the time, they keep going back until they get the answer the EU wants. And as soon as the EU gets the answer it wants, the issue is considered closed. They never vote again on it once it's gone through. And this has happened across the European Union over many decades. So in other words, Britain has given the EU the wrong answer. And these calls for a second referendum, I still don't think there's going to be one. And the reason I say that is the sheer logistics behind actually having a referendum, insofar as the Electoral Commission requires 6 months' notice to have a referendum. They then have to appoint official campaigns for both sides, which is a task in itself. Then you've got to have the campaign, then you've got to have the vote. So you're looking to the end of this year or well into next year, even if you announce tomorrow that you're going to have one. And the other thing is this would open up a Pandora's box so far as constitutional requirements go, in that for example, in 2011 or 2013, there was a referendum in Scotland for Scottish independence, which was defeated. And even the SNP, which is the Scottish National Party, said that this is a once-in-a-generation referendum. Well, if we have a second EU referendum so close to the first, they could legitimately argue, well, why can't I have a referendum on Scottish independence again? And you know, they keep going back time and time again until they get the answer they want. Alternatively, you could argue in Wales, where I live, that there was a referendum in 1997 about the creation of a Welsh Assembly. Now, fewer than 1 in 4 of the Welsh electorate actually voted for it to be created. There were only 6,000 votes in it, if you accept that the vote was legitimate. I mean, it's well within the margin of error for starters. And I've heard that some very strange things happened at counts that night. But there would be a legitimate campaign then for a fresh referendum on the existence of the Welsh Assembly.
Hey, bring it on.
And in other words, it would open up a box. It would set a very dangerous precedent to have a second referendum at the moment. And I don't think it's going to happen for the reasons I've listed. But going back to what you were saying about currencies a minute ago, I don't claim any great expertise in silver or that. But I'd make this point. What you and Greg said was correct. And I was aware of the whole Libya story. And there's quite a lot of reading to be done on the internet about the creation of the African currency, which Gaddafi wanted. But what I would say is, I agree with Greg when he says that big currency fluctuations are probably a thing of the past. But I also think that the reason there has been relative calm on the currency markets is that the global traders are betting, if you like, on Britain not leaving the EU anytime soon.
Indeed.
And I think that could be a big mistake. I think that's what they're gambling on in effect, but I think that could be a big mistake. They are under the impression, going back to what you said a moment ago about there being a long extension and being kicked further into the long grass. They may be correct, but I wouldn't be complacent about that. So I think that may go some way towards explaining the relative calm we've seen.
I would agree with that, because 1 minute they think they're going to have a deal, the next minute they think they're not going to have a deal. And of course, we've had multiple votes in the House of Commons. And therefore, until those votes are known, people don't quite know which way to jump. Now, if we do leave, do you gentlemen see sterling falling or rising?
Greg, you go first.
Coward. I would say that sterling will fall. I don't think it'll be anything like as dramatic as people think. And I think it will stabilize within about 18 months, say, let's at the outside say 2 years. So it will fall and it will stabilize fairly near to what it is anyway. When people realize the world has not ended, when they realize that there are only 500 million people in the European Union, that's 500 million people, including Britain. You're nearer 400 million when we leave. I personally have absolutely no doubt that we will be leaving, because I don't think this country will be governable if we don't. I really don't think that the public will tolerate being treated like dirt. It's just not in our nature. And may I refer you to Kipling, his poem about the ox, and do look it up. It is so prescient to the situation at the moment. I included it in one of my controversially Greg postings the other day. We're a very obdurate people, and we always have been. Throughout the Middle Ages, we were known as the goddams because we didn't give a good goddamn whose side we fought on. We were effectively just spoiling for a fight across Europe. Most of which, I might add, we won, despite being a tiny little island.
Okay, Marcus, your view.
Yes, I'm thinking back now to the day after the referendum, and I recorded the news bulletins that were on BBC television that day, and I've kept them, and I've watched them back in the day since. Now, before the referendum, we were told by certain journalists, people like James O'Brien and certain others, were saying, "Oh, if we vote leave, that the sterling's going to collapse the next day, the FTSE's going to collapse, this, that, and the other." What happened is that when the markets opened that morning, the day after the referendum, when the result was known, that morning, the FTSE did fall quite substantially and the pound did fall quite substantially. But the FTSE had largely recovered by lunchtime that day, and within a matter of days, it had recovered. This is the FTSE 100 index now, and within a matter of days, it had recovered completely, and within a matter of months, it was hitting record highs. The pound did fall, but you look at the pound to euro on a graph and it's hovering around the same level it was in about 2012, and it's a double-edged sword. Okay, it's not so great if you're going on holiday at the moment, but it does help our exporters, and it's good for tourists who are coming to Britain. But I watched back those BBC news bulletins, and they're so funny because they were talking as though, and the BBC, by the way, and this might get me into trouble, I don't really mind, it is institutionally pro-EU to the core. And what I've looking back at those bulletins,
funded by the EU,
they are indeed. But to just finish this point, those news bulletins, looking back at them now, they are so funny. They say, "Oh, the pound has plummeted and the FTSE has collapsed," and actually, yes, the pound was a bit weaker and it stayed at that level it was at 2012 against the euro. I'll come on to the dollar in a sec. But the FTSE, it largely sorted itself out by lunchtime that day, and within a few days it recovered completely. They do get a bit caught up in their own nonsense, these people sometimes, these reporters. On the subject of the dollar, yes, it is at the pound to dollar ratio is much lower now. But again, that helps our exporters, and you've got to look at it, and our exporters, frankly, could have done with a boost and continue to be able to do with a boost. Will it always stay at that level? Well, no, it won't. You know, things will happen that none of us here have even thought of in the fullness of time. But the alarmist language that was used on news bulletins was something else, and I've kept them, and they are funny to look back on. So what do I think would happen if the UK left the EU anytime soon? I think Greg is essentially correct. It is something that would that there would be a period, I don't know how long that period would be, where the pound is weaker against the euro. But we need to remember something else as well, and that the euro itself is in big trouble. Because I don't claim the same level of expertise on economics as you, but what I would say is I am aware of the Italian banking crisis. It's been kicked into the long grass for the time being. I'm aware of the situation in Greece and Spain and Portugal, where you've got mass youth unemployment and banking situation there. And I go back to a very, very basic level. How many countries are in the euro at the moment? Somebody tell me. 17, is it?
I think it's 17.
Okay, thank you. You cannot have one currency with one interest rate and 17 finance ministers, because the fiscal discipline you need someone in Britain, it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You need an authority to ensure the fiscal discipline to run that currency. And one of the big weaknesses of the euro is one of the things you do, and in this country it's been used many times and it continues to be used, is you vary interest rates depending on your economic circumstances to heat things up or cool things down. Italy and Southern Europe in particular is on a totally unsuitable interest rate. I have got family in Italy. There was an earthquake in the village where my family are. And here we are 5 years later, they still haven't got around to repairing the buildings because the money simply isn't there. Italy also has a huge problem with youth unemployment. So whatever happens to the pound, the euro is going to have big problems not too far down the road. And that will be reflected in the pound to euro ratio in the fullness of time. So Brexit would be a temporary situation with regards to the pound, is what I'm saying.
That's also something that you said, look at the situation in Greece and Italy on currency. Let's be a bit more fundamental. The European Union is a Franco-German construct to stop the pair of them squabbling. The reason they have squabbled historically is Germany is an industrial heartland and France is an agrarian heartland. The main reason of the CAP is to transfer French agricultural wealth in exchange with German industrial wealth, and other countries around the periphery of these two Germanic tribes, the Franks and the Germans, are merely there, as far as they're concerned, to feed it. And you ask about the euro, or you comment on the euro and you say Italy and France. Well, Portugal's just about flat busted. Spain hasn't put a project in of any size for years that wasn't paid for by Europe. Ireland has roads that run out because, in a dead end, because their nice new highway, the grant ran out. The euro is, as a currency, a bit of a farce, especially when you think that this highly successful European Union that everyone is being told about, well, how many countries around the world have had riots in their main cities for 21 consecutive weekends? That's France. France is a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Yet every weekend they're turning chemical weapons on their own middle-class protesters, because there is nothing amusing about the industrial level at which they are using tear gas. It is a gas, it is damaging, and it's, shall we say, the soft end of chemical weapons, and nobody is saying anything against
But it's better than bullets that are used in Russia and in China, Greg.
Oh, much better.
So right,
but
Marcus,
they are using rubber bullets on their population,
well, some of them
every weekend.
Marcus, I didn't want to interrupt you. 19 countries are using the euro,
19,
or they're part of the Eurozone. Okay, there are more countries that use the euro, but it's not their indigenous currency, so it's 19. All right, let me run through. I've just scrolled now. I've got a whole list of questions or comments here. So I'm going back. Cabadejo and Bumble have been asking or making some points. So let me read Cabadejo's and then I'll read Bumble's. Cabadejo has said, if the euro collapses, what is to happen in Europe? Go back to the Deutschmark, franc, etc. But the euro collapsed, the European banking system collapsed. Everything is so connected, except those who are stacking gold to the ceiling. Why? I'm going to have to visit Cabadejo's house because she must have so much gold in her house.
We'll go at night.
Why go at night? Yes, for the mask. Why to buffer against the house of the dollar coming down? It also says selling treasuries to finance the Belt and Road, a new economic system and a new trading alliance. Irrespective of party, the same basic program keeps running. Global warming, deindustrialization, more control, disarming the people, more perversion, more corporatization. The people do not have a say and no one is listening, so the public is dirt. And there we go. Cabadejo said the euro is the official currency for 19 of the 28 EU member countries. And Bumble has said the euro will not disappear. Too many Europeans are committed to it. A more likely alternative is that the EU will create a new fiscal authority with powers to create currency.
May I comment on that?
Yeah, let me just finish a little bit. The EU will move towards doing what Japan is doing. And then, he says 28 countries in the EU. Right. So go on, please, Marcus.
Yes, but I want to look at this in a big picture way. Now, at some point, I think it's inevitable that the euro will collapse. And I think the question is, when that comes, can we dismantle it gently, brick by brick, or is it going to be messy? And what we're seeing across the European Union, whether it's Orban or Conte or the situation in Greece where the EU effectively overthrew a democratically elected government, we're seeing what used to be called the middle ground disappearing in politics, and people are electing to the left and the right. And you've got a situation in Italy which has a proportional representation way of electing, where you've got two Eurosceptic parties who don't like each other very much at all, but they are both Eurosceptic. It's the Five Star Movement and the Liga del Nord. Both have unpleasant elements to them. I'm particularly not keen on the Liga del Nord, having met some of their representatives as well. But what we're seeing is, can we dismantle this sensibly and logically? The only comparison I can think of is when the reunification of Germany happened, is that the East German currency and the West German currency, it was 1 mark each. There was a parity, which ended up costing West Germany a fortune at the time. But what I would say, look at what's happening around the world now, not just in Europe. The old political establishment is falling apart, and people are going to what used to be called the extremes, although that is not a word I'm keen on. And we're seeing it, whether it's with Trump in America, who is the nearest any of us can remember to an independent president who's neither liked by the Republican nor the Democratic Party. We're seeing what's happened in Brazil. We're seeing what's happened across the European Union. And it's going to be more difficult to replicate anything along those lines in Britain because of our first past the post electoral system in the House of Commons. But it has happened before, insofar as the Labour Party in the early parts, the second and third decades of the 20th century, appeared from almost nowhere and became a government of, well, Ramsay MacDonald was the first, wasn't he, to become Prime Minister for Labour, and appeared from nowhere. So I think the big question about the whole the euro currency and indeed the EU project as a whole is that we now need to say, look, the 19 countries who are in the euro or use the euro, 19 finance ministers, 1 interest rate, vastly different economic circumstances in Germany to what you see in Southern Europe. Can we dismantle this sensibly and without violence and without hardship, or are they going to dig their heels into the ground, the political establishment, and we're going to see what's happened in France one weekend after another replicated across the EU? And that is, to be honest, what I fear, that this is going to be, that the political will is there to keep it going so far as the political establishment, but we are seeing anti-establishment governments. I abhor what is called the far right and what that stands for. I abhor fascism. And I do not want to see racist governments anywhere, but people are turning to these sort of movements out of desperation because of the lack of economic opportunities and because of uncontrolled mass immigration, mainly from Africa coming into Europe as a result of what we were talking about earlier, the goings on in Libya in the early part of the current decade. It's a spillover from that. And what's gone on more recently in Syria as well. So I think that if common sense prevails, can we dismantle this without violence and without resorting to extremism? Or are they going to just dogmatically stick to this EU project, which is harming people in Southern Europe, and it's now spreading to other parts of the EU? They dogmatically stick to it. There may be very serious consequences indeed in the fullness of time.
Marcus, you're younger than Greg and I, and therefore your memory will serve you better. But if you recall, there was a time in British history about the John Major period, early 90s, where the UK was advocating what they called enlargement of Europe or widening of Europe as opposed to deepening. Because I think it would be fair to say that certainly all the conservative politicians in this country signed up to the European Union with basically almost unwillingly, although Ted Heath was the guy who took us in. But since then have regretted it somewhat and actually sabotaged it a little, because they knew that what was supposed to be an economic union was turning into a political union. And they thought that one of the best strategies to prevent the political side taking over was to enlarge it. In other words, bring in new countries at a rapid pace, which would therefore prevent the deepening. Now, the dilemma with that was that we then introduced a number of countries, Greece being one, but a lot of the former Soviet countries, Poland and others, coming into the EU that were, at economically unfit and unable to do so. And secondly, we're at the wrong trade cycle. So that, as you rightly say, once they end up with a single currency, single interest rate, or single exchange rate, that is it. If they go in at a disadvantageous position, they'll almost always be at a disadvantageous position. And are we not seeing that now? The folly of that strategy.
Well, I think we need to put what you've just said into a little bit of context, particularly what's going on with the expansion eastwards, which happened throughout the 1990s into the early 2000s in the European Union. And I was working in Latvia at the end of 2013, and what struck me there, I was there in the November, early December. They were adopting the euro the following January. So I was there in November, December 2013. They adopted the euro in January 2014. And what struck me is, well, there's two things I'll say. The first thing is the people were very nice. And I was in a town called Daugavpils in the south of Latvia, which is very different to the country's capital, Riga. Daugavpils feels very Russian, and you sense it when you're there. And the people I sensed were very reluctant to talk about politics in general. When you're sitting in a bar late at night talking, they were reluctant to talk about politics in general. And if they would do so quite cautiously. And the sense I got from them is that the reason that Latvia was so keen in getting involved in the EU project and their neighboring countries, Lithuania, then as you head more towards Central Europe, Poland, is that they wanted to get away from what's known as the Russian sphere of influence. And with the breakup of the USSR and the former Yugoslavia, these countries sought sanctuary in the EU because they feared what Russia had done to them being repeated again. And the people are very nervous about Vladimir Putin, and they see the EU as a sanctuary out of that. Now, these people are not stupid. They are aware that the euro and the EU is not exactly great. You spend decades and decades fighting for freedom and fighting for democracy, and then you sacrifice a huge amount of it to be in the bureaucratic EU almost immediately. But that's the wider context of it. But to answer your original point, going back to the John Major era, insofar as widening the EU, well, I suppose there's a certain logic to that, but you've widened it to such an extent with so many conflicting economic and even social circumstances that it has become ungovernable. And we're now seeing evidence of this even in the more established EU countries. The conflict between France and, to an extent, Germany and certainly Italy, it's now ungovernable. And it's a question of, do we dismantle this sensibly and change the nature of the relationship between the countries, of one where we sit down and discuss our differences sensibly around the table rather than shoot each other? But political union has been proven, I think, now to fail.
I think you're spot on right, Marcus, in saying that. Basically, the countries along the periphery of Russia that have managed to escape from the thrall of Russia are merely using Europe to stop Russia pouring back in again. We have all very close to a full-blown war going on in the Ukraine because the European Union was so ballistically stupid that it got involved with the Ukraine, trying to persuade it to join the European Union because it would look like a large achievement, overlooking the fact that Russia, post-communism, has readopted religion. And the religion of Russia is largely the Russian Orthodox Church. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church and the center of it is Kiev. So there is no way on this planet that Russia is likely to let Ukraine drift into the European Union. However, you also have to bear in mind that many Germans, particularly, have drifted into the Soviet Union. Take Schroeder of Germany, for instance, who immediately he retired was appointed as an oligarch and is now a director of Russia's Gazprom and numerous other companies. So Russia is more dangerous in many ways than people think. It was utterly understandable that they seized back Crimea when their main naval port and also holiday resort
Sevastopol,
that was on a hot sea, was likely to be threatened by Europe. Yes, they went back into Crimea. I think that the European project is so much of an experiment that people need to look at its foundations, which, although it's very popular to say, oh, it's a Fourth Reich, actually way predate Nazi Germany. Yes, Funk wrote Europäische Gemeinschaft, and if anybody wants a copy, I can send them a URL to read it.
Do you want to put that on to either
I
the
can
forum
stick that
or
on the forum and access point.
Or even the bulletin board, if you wish, Greg.
Yeah.
Either of the
And
two.
that does not show that it is a Fourth Reich concept. You had people like Spinelli, who, while he was in prison in Italy, long before, wrote the paper which was one of the foundation documents of the European Union. The main parents of the European Union, I would say realistically, are probably Spinelli and Monnet. And Monnet very clearly said, we will advance this by stealth without people realizing to become a political union. And that was years ago. Anybody who's in any doubt of this, please go and read Richard North's and Christopher Booker's admirable book, The Great Deception. It covers all these points. One of our biggest problems in the European Union, and particularly in Britain, is our politicians haven't a clue how it works. They really are fumbling in the dark.
Now, we've got lots of points being made, so I do want to deal with this. JPJ Murph has said Ray Dalio. Now, Ray Dalio, gentlemen, is an American multi-billionaire, and he runs, I believe it's the largest hedge fund in the world, called Bridgewater or Bridgewater Associates, okay? And he's very much admired and followed, and I follow him too. I think he's one of the few people very similar to, I've forgotten his name, Richards, who has his feet pretty firmly on the ground, but he has been stating that we are very close to an economic collapse in the next year or two. But Ray Dalio, he says, stating that socioeconomic situation is similar to the 1930s. What are the chances of the UK breaking up? Okay, point one. And Cabadejo has said, they escaped the Soviets. Is Russia so bad? It has the healthiest economy at the moment. Germany is turning to Russia. We will see a China-Russia-German axis. Gentlemen, views on that?
Can I make a start on his question about the UK breaking up? I don't think it's as likely as we're being told. Now we go back to the referendum in the Scottish referendum of, what was it, 2013, wasn't it? There was an independence referendum in Scotland, and then there was a general election in 2015, and it was one of those things that happens only once in a generation in British politics. I mentioned how the Labour Party came up very quickly in the second and third decade of the 20th century in the House of Commons in the first post-voting system, the SNP made enormous gains at the 2015 general election, taking seats mainly from the Labour Party in Scotland. This was 2 years after the Scottish independence referendum. But then we had another general election in 2017, the fabled one called by Theresa May. The SNP went backwards. And in areas that are devolved...
Do you want to explain what the SNP is? That's the Scottish National Party.
The Scottish National Party. Yeah. Now, in Scotland itself, the SNP is the governing party in the Scottish Parliament for areas that are devolved to Scotland, like health and education. And people in Scotland, that they've had a good few years to set a track record, and people in Scotland are, let's just say, not very satisfied. And you know, they're being held to account, and all governments in the end run out of steam in democracies, it seems to me. And what's happened in Scotland is it's not so much the Labour Party that has capitalised on that, but the Conservative Party in Scotland, under the leadership of Ruth Davidson, has had a revival of sorts. And we saw in Scotland at the 2017 general election for Westminster, the House of Commons, the Conservative Party gaining seats in Scotland that they hadn't held for quite some time. Absolutely. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out in the next Scottish parliamentary elections, but my gut instinct is that the SNP and the Scottish independence movement has, for the time being at least, run out of steam. Onto the issue of Wales, where I live, demand for Welsh independence, if you look at opinion polls, is rarely into double figures, let alone beyond that. The Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, has just 4 of the 40 seats, Welsh seats in the House of Commons. They are almost entirely in West and Northwest Wales. And beyond that, there is not really that much demand. The Labour Party is the predominant party in Wales, in both the Welsh Assembly for areas that are devolved and also insofar as Westminster seats. The Conservative Party has a significant presence, but Labour is by far and away the biggest party. So I don't fear the breakup of the United Kingdom. And I would add to that if Brexit happens, and I think it will happen, I think that will also do immense damage to both the Scottish and the Welsh independence movements, because then both the SNP, the Scottish National Party, and Plaid Cymru will have to sell the prospect of Scotland and Wales becoming members of the
EU
in their own right. And that in itself would have implications, because all new member states are expected to adopt the euro. They would also have to argue the case for a hard border between Scotland and England and Wales and England. Now, those of us, I live in Wales, and that prospect sounds utterly absurd. Customs checks as you go over the Severn Bridge or heading out towards Herefordshire from Monmouthshire. It would just sound so far-fetched as to be utterly implausible. So I believe that Brexit, a United Kingdom Brexit, will actually do immense damage to both the Scottish and Welsh independence movements.
And Greg, what about the Soviet Union? Russia's economy, according to Capitasia, is not so bad. It's one of the healthiest economies at the moment, and Germany is turning to Russia, and we will possibly, Bumble said, rebuild Offa's Dyke. We will see a China-Russia-German axis. Do you foresee that? China-Russia.
I live within less than 2 miles of Offa's Dyke. And yes, I think that the prospect of an independent Wales is a farce. Bear in mind that apart from 8 years in the whole of history, Wales has never been a nation.
But can we move on to Russia, Greg? Because we're running
certainly.
out of time. Do you see a China-Russia-German axis?
Russia has a fantastic economy. It's absolutely superlative if you happen to be an oligarch. Otherwise, it's bloody misery. I don't call that an economy. I call that a wealth scam by an elite that hold their entire nation in a fairly brutal grip. There are town after town after town across Russia that is abandoned because they have siphoned into the cities where they live 4 and 5 to a room, where heating is only on intermittently, where glass is quite unusual in windows, if that's an economy, I don't think it's something to aspire to.
I'm going by
they have immense wealth in terms of oil, gas, and diamonds. But bear in mind, they killed millions of their own citizens in order to try to connect the country up with roads. They probably got through a greater weight of citizens than they did of tarmac building some of those roads. To live in Kamchatka, in the mining areas there, is a misery. I'm sorry, I can't see anything to aspire to in Russia. I remember back in the 60s, the MiGs, everybody knew that you only had to go to altitude and the pilots froze to death.
Yes.
They were so rudimentary.
I haven't had chance.
I just cannot see Russia as a successful economy. I'm sorry.
No, well, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I remember I was completing an article for a client of mine a few months ago. And if I'm wrong here, please quote, because I'm going from memory. The population of Russia is about 145 million.
Yeah.
And the latest reports, which was a couple of years ago, there were 22 million living below the poverty line. So now,
and I think their poverty line is a hell of a lot lower than ours.
Yeah, correct, that's what I was going to say. So I'm not quite so sure that the Russian economy is doing that well, which was why they wanted to try and do a deal with Trump to relieve some of the what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the restrictions put on some of their commercial entities. Anyway, Marcus, anything to add on that? Because what I want to do, because I'm conscious of time, and we have focused one heck of a lot on the EU. I will say I did miss this. Bowman has, I think it was Bowman, let me just have a look. Yes, he says CS gas is an illegal gas according to the Geneva Convention. However, the countries that have signed not to use the gas on foreign troops or population. It is legal for those countries to use CS on their own population. So thank you for that, Bowman.
You're correct. The Geneva Convention does not pertain to civilian situations.
Yeah.
So you can murder your own people and nobody bats an eyelid,
absolutely.
especially if you're French.
So, Joan, just to round this off, I do want to do a bit of housekeeping as well, and there are areas we wanted to cover, but we haven't yet. But broadly, in view of what you've said, A, about Brexit, B, about currencies generally, obviously the people who join us, their fundamental interest is the price or value of gold and silver. Now, I don't want to go down the route of how you should value gold and silver. Should it be in dollar terms? Shouldn't it be in dollar terms? Because at the moment, it's priced in dollars, unless you're in the UK and then you have to buy it in sterling, or if you're in Europe, you buy it in euros. How do you guys see the price of gold and silver, say, over the next 6 months or so? Because my analysis is not good for gold and silver prices, I have to say. I think we're going to see, although there are many reasons why the prices should go up, my calculations, and that's doing a mixture of fundamental analysis as well as technical analysis, and looking also at the reports coming out from various countries about GDP growth. Silver's future, in my view, and I'll express my view briefly, for the next 6 to 12, maybe even 12 months, 2 years, its progress is going to be hampered by our industrial demand actually falling, for the simple reason the economies are growing less. So the only thing that will revive the price of silver, therefore, will be its monetary demand. In other words, it's linked to gold. However, that said, of course, if the value of sterling falls, which we believe it probably will post-Brexit, then, of course, the price of gold and silver will go up in sterling. terms.
Mm.
But the interplay with the euro and the dollar, if the dollar maintains its relative strength, then of course that's not good for gold and silver prices. If the dollar falls, then certainly as far as it's quoted in that currency, then gold and silver will rise. I mean, what's your? I'm giving it to you from an analysis point of view, but very often traders don't just go by fundamental or technical analysis. There's also a degree of speculation and forward-looking assessments. So, Greg, your view, and Marcus, your view.
I think basically, and I've voiced it here before, gold and silver, gold being the primary one, doesn't appreciate in value. It merely
Maintains value.
It moves together with currencies in the long run. If you look at the price of an ounce of gold 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years ago, it's more or less exactly the same as it is now in monetary terms, if you look at the inflation of money over the same period. So it's a very safe way of making sure you end up with the same amount of money as you put into it in the first place, even if the currency devalues. Silver is more of a working commodity. I think there is less and less call for it as other industries grow. There is, because of the fashion for electricity in terms of batteries and mobile phones and automotive, is calling for chemicals other than silver.
Although there are silver elements in those products, Greg.
There are, but
the growth,
a fraction of other commodities. And increasingly, the silver elements, I think, will fall away. Silver will be revert to being more ornamental and an investment commodity because it also looks nice. We've taken it out of our currency. It used to be the currency.
But if I stop you there,
but we found alternatives.
Second, Greg. Yeah, but if I stop you there a second, that is in the UK. In America, more and more states are now accepting silver as a currency alternative, and it's quite prevalent there. And of course, you're aware there's some third world countries that are you allowing silver. They haven't changed it for their currency, but they are allowing it to be used as their currency. So, do you not? I mean, my view on silver and gold long term is very positive, I have to admit, and I've always stipulated that. However, short term, I see a little bit more downside. It shouldn't be the case. In fairness, it should not be the case. But it is because of the strength of the dollar, and that's how it's priced. But in terms of sterling, I think it's close to the. It's not at the low, but it's close to the low, I suspect, because we expect sterling to weaken.
The way I would describe gold is I don't claim any expertise in this. I have no qualifications in this area whatsoever. But looking at gold and the history of gold, I would describe it as a very good long-term insurance policy for your money. That is how I look at it, and that's how I continue to look at it. What it'll be in 6 months, I don't know. I'm not going to make any comment on where we'll be in 6 months. But in the long term, I think there's a stability about it. And it's a way of ensuring your money investment in the long term for the reasons Greg has said already.
Thank you, Marcus. Right, very briefly then, a little bit of housekeeping. Greg, I have spoken to the web designer, and as you know, we've been working on a different forum, and what he's agreed to do, and we're hoping it's going to happen this coming week, If it doesn't, it will be the following week, but we're hoping this week there will be a second forum. We will. It's you've seen the sort of outskirts of it, haven't you, Greg?
Yeah.
It's more user friendly. It will enable members to interact with each other if they wish to buy and sell gold, silver, or whatever it is, as long as it's not drugs or anything like that. But the difficulty is going to be
Hang on there.
transferring.
We may have slight problems if Bard wants to put another 100 million into cryptocurrency.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, come on to that to say it. Yes. So what will happen? We'll have the old forum. What we can't do is transfer all the data from the old forum to the new one. Okay, that's what I'm advised at this stage. So we'll keep the old one there. The new one, once it comes live, we'll notify everyone and we'll ask people to gradually migrate to the new forum. If we can transfer the data, we will, but I'm told it's unlikely, okay, because the two aren't quite compatible. So, and then we'll have a time point at which then we'll stop the old one and just utilize the new one. Okay?
But we will leave the old one there.
Yes, for reference purposes.
As a reference,
yes.
Because there's some very good material on there.
Yes. Also, I have written to a number of people for interviews. I've had only one or two responses that want me to call them and discuss it with them in advance. So they're quite cautious because they know we're quite aggressive. But I am waiting still to hear from a few of them. It's a little disappointing because I had hoped we'd get more. But this week, as you know, I was in Rome last week. This week, I'll have a lot more time to actually chase these people up more aggressively. I have pointed out to them that
it's your aggression they're worried about.
I know. I really don't know why. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, if they believe in what they're saying, did you see that Jim Wiley fellow? He's called, I can't remember what he's called something Jackass or something. I was listening. I've got to say this. I mean, we're not here to condemn other people, but for goodness sake, this guy has got quite a significant following. Greg Hunter interviews him. All of the pumpers interview him. And this loon said 3 or 4 years ago, or it might even be 2 or 3 years ago, Germany is pulling out of the EU. Now, can you guys believe that? He said, I have it on good authority. My secret contacts have told me that Germany is pulling out of the EU. For goodness sake.
Well, let's put him in the same bracket as David Icke and Alex Jones in that case, because people like that, it's not worth even going into that.
I remember it at the time, and then I was he came up again, and he's heralded by some of these people as some genius. And I thought, I've got to look this up. And I might even, once I find the video again, I'll put it up. Yeah, his secret intelligence operatives have told him Germany is pulling out of the European Union. There you go.
A broken clock is right twice a day. And what these conspiracy theorists do is they have the odd hit now and again. And their worshippers online say that means that everything they say is true. Now, there was one last year, wasn't there? What was his name now? He was an American fella who kept releasing coded secrets about Trump. And he said, Trump is going to reveal this about Hillary Clinton soon. I forget his name now. I can't remember what his name was.
Melania?
No, do either of you remember the guy I was talking about? I remember I discussed it with Greg a bit last year. And he kept saying, Trump is going to release these files about whoever. And then he said things like, May is going to be a very bad month for Pope Francis. And last May came and went, and nothing particularly significant happened. But his followers were saying, yes, but there was a paedophile priest scandal in Australia. But there's one of those somewhere in the world every month. So these people who have these followings online, they come up with these theories, and those who follow them, who are often quite obsessive people, say, yes, but he got that one right. And what about the other 100 predictions he got wrong? And even the one he got right, you've got to read in between the lines, because very often they're very vague in their predictions. So let's park these conspiracy theorists to one side, I think.
Yeah,
But there's
I've
so
been
many
trying to do that with Corbyn for a long time.
Well, Cavendish has quite rightly highlighted, he's called Golden Jackass. And then, oh, I've lost it now. Golden Jackass.
Very appropriate.
Yes, I have. I've actually lost it. Oh, yes. And she says, the voice told him the voice in his head. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Greg, where do you, right, Cavendish wants to know where you get your information on Russia. Bumble has said, hang on, he's definitely the lunatic fringe of the precious metals community. And Cavadeja says, all CIA assets and Tatvambindu, you mean Q? What's Q? I've missed that. Perhaps, were you saying anything about Q, James? I've missed that. Oh, all right, you mean Q, CIA assets, okay. Yeah, Greg, where'd you get your info on
QAnon, that was it. QAnon,
you're being
got
challenged.
QAnon, that's what I was thinking of, guys.
QAnon, right,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay.
Um,
Greg,
Russia,
reveal your Russian sources and don't say Donald Trump.
Russia, I've sort of watched fairly closely for a very long time. My father was military intelligence after the war, and has crossed Russia many times at very low level in fast jets as a pilot, testing air readiness of the Russian Air Force, which was usually pretty hopeless. Was involved in the Gary Powell incident with the U-2. Then we were living in Germany, where he was on perpetual air readiness for several years. So I've always taken something of an interest in Russia. A family friend who unfortunately died recently was a director of Schlumberger, who you will either know and realize is a massive organization, or will never have heard of. There doesn't seem to be much of a happy medium with their name. They are a research and development geological company that tends to find most of the world's oil, working for the companies that we all know the names of, like Exxon and BP and Shell and so on. He did a trip around Russia, working closely with Citibank, and when you think that the Russian mines tend to have two dropsmen on the lifts, usually babushkas, sort of retired women, and they employ women, and they always employ two, so that if one of them is drunk, the other one will take over. They have factories that make shoes, where they make the left shoes in one town and the right shoes in the other town, so that people don't steal them off the production line, where there are great swathes of Russia that are just riddled with poverty, alongside immense wealth. The country has been raped by its ruling class throughout its history. They no longer call themselves czars, they're now oligarchs.
Greg, you mentioned the company Schlumberger. Was that
Schlumberger.
correct? Sorry?
Schlumberger.
Oh, Schlumberger. You'll have to spell it, because Schlumberger is an American company.
No, Schlumberger is a French company.
Yeah.
As I recall, was owned by Madame Schlumberger, who was one of the richest women in the world.
And what does it deal with?
Geology.
Right. Okay. Marcus, anything you wish to add? We're coming to a close. It's nearly 10:30 UK time. Anything you want to add in
Yeah,
terms of what we've been covering?
Yeah, it's just what Greg was saying about oligarchs there. One of the observations I make, I'm aware that a lot of people are listening to this in the United States, and that is, you'll know in the United States that Premier League soccer, as you call it, is getting quite good viewing figures on NBCSN out there. And a lot of the clubs in this country in the Premier League are owned by well, almost all Premier League clubs are owned by foreign owners, but we know about Russian oligarchs buying into the Premier League. And I often wonder why they actually do this. Now, we know about rich people like playing with toys and using it as status symbols, and whether the Arab owners or the Russian owners or whoever, and the American owners are doing it for that reason. But I think with the Russian oligarchs, they're doing it for another reason as well. And that's to make themselves slightly more high profile, or a lot more high profile in the UK and in other parts of the world, as a sort of safety mechanism. They're less likely to be assassinated if lots and lots of people know who they are. It's also a means of ploughing their money into something where it can't be discovered in quite the same way. So there are other motives.
That was sort of money laundering then.
You used that term, I avoided it, but you've used it. I didn't want to use that expression, but that's you can read into it what you will. So yes, I think that's the two motivations why. One is for the reason you just said, and the other is because it increases their profile, and if they fall out with Putin, they become harder to assassinate.
There is an opinion that even people like Bezos are paupers when you compare them with Putin. He is the modern Tsar with his palaces and his immediate access to the exchequer of Russia. It is a country of great division,
and
not
Marcus,
a happy place to be.
It's not, no. And Marcus, because this is your first webinar with us, we have now. We don't have a huge number of people listening to this here, but we do normally have a considerable number listening once we put it onto the website. So to all those who are live, I would very much appreciate whether you think this timing is appropriate or whether you think it should be a different time and a different date. But please bear in mind that the three of us from the UK, so we are somewhat bound by UK time, but the purpose of our webinar is for the benefit of our members, most of which, to be fair, are either US, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, parts of Europe, as well as the United Kingdom. So
Australia and the Antipodes, of course, are going out on a Sunday morning, which is probably infinitely better than if we had the webinars at any other time than in the evening. Because
Tat Vabindu has just said the time's okay for me in Australia Sunday morning, and I want us to have this. We have focused an awful lot on the UK and on the EU and Brexit. The reason for that is because some very important decisions are to be made over the next few days and few weeks, which will have an impact on the euro and on sterling, and ultimately the euro-dollar relationship, which therefore to some degree affects the prices of gold and silver.
I think that's another point that everybody's overlooking. It will have a huge effect on systems of governance around the world in the long term. We've established, beyond any shadow of doubt, that our democracy, which is closer to being a democracy than anywhere in Europe, much closer than being a democracy in America, and takes some rivaling, but it has established over this period that it is without a doubt broken. And I think Britain will be a country to watch over the next 10 years as a new model emerges, because I really cannot see it continuing.
A tradition is like a tree. It can take years and years and decades to build up, and yet one act of vandalism can destroy it. And I think what we've seen in the House of Commons in recent weeks has been constitutional vandalism.
And I don't think that the politicians are sufficiently in touch with the country. They live in their Westminster bubble. They don't realise just how heinous the damage they've done is, and just how bloody angry a lot of people in this country are.
Spot on.
And a final note, gentlemen, on a controversial issue. In America, as you know, the Mueller report has been issued. Barr, the Attorney General, has come out with a summary, and he's written 4 letters in total. The House of Representatives are demanding, or various committees are demanding, the report in full, because they believe Barr is covering up critical comments made against President Trump. We haven't really got time to debate this, and perhaps we'll do it next time, but just in a couple of sentences, what's your view and how do you see it panning out? Do you think that the Mueller report will ultimately be revealed to, at least A, to Congress, and B, whether the American people will get to see it?
Well, I think it should be released to Congress, because so far we just got the word of what we're being told. It's gone through a filter, and it may well be that we're not being given the full picture. I don't think Donald Trump is a stupid man. I think he's a crass man. He's been caught lying a number of times. But I think we can only make a fair assessment once we've seen the report in full, rather than it going through the filter of Donald Trump's, the people very close to him. Greg?
Donald Trump is a propagandist. He's not a diplomat. He has very little ability other than bombast. And he's set up in a system which I would submit is diabolically flawed and broken. One only has to listen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's
New Green Deal
in front of the Congress Committee on Ethics to realize just how corrupt the American system is. I must say, I found it a superb interview. You will find it on YouTube. I think it's been watched so far by something like 40 million people, because it is such an exemplar of what is going on in America.
And Bumble has asked, do our American members here think that Trump will win a second term? Now, we're not American members. We're looking at this from across the pond. Greg, let's answer Bumble's question. As things are at the moment, will Trump win a second term in 2020?
Firstly, the caveat, a week in politics is a long time.
Yeah.
I think it's a little foolish to actually make that double guess now. I don't think his age plays well for him, looking at a second term, because he would be particularly a great deal older, and looking at his familial track record, I would say that he will probably step down after this term. Much as he might like to go on to make sure that he isn't prosecuted.
Yes, Marcus?
Yeah, what I would say is this. The United States, there's so many good things we can say about it in terms of business, entertainment, sport, Hollywood, the movies.
Yeah.
America has contributed so much to this world, and yet the last presidential race, it came down to Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And my reaction was, is this really the best you guys can do?
Yeah.
Out of all the brains you've got in that country and all the wonderful things you've contributed to this world, and I love America and I love Americans, is this really the best you can do? And yet here we are several years later, And I don't see anyone really coming through, particularly from the Democrat side, who we can say, yeah, this is a president in waiting. This is someone who is mature, who debates in an adult way, who is addressing the concerns of the American people. And there's no standout candidate that I have seen. You know, all this talk about Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden putting his hand around women and all this sort of thing. Where is this next generation coming from? Let's, you know, nothing against 70-year-olds, Greg, but where are the 40-year-olds and the 50-year-olds who should be coming?
I agree. It was me said he's too old.
Marcus, it's amusing you say that, because I know you can't see the live chat, which I can, and Cavadeja says almost the same thing. Who is the opposition? There is no one. All the Democrats have done is to sabotage Trump, so what would you vote on? I will put forward a thesis. I'm not saying I necessarily believe in it, but the thesis is, we all know, and I can say I know, Trump's commercial dealings have been, inverted commas, dirty to say the least. And there are no doubt indictable offenses, not while he's president, but indictable offenses that his businesses have carried out with him at the helm. Do not be surprised if a trade-off is made that Trump doesn't stand for a second term, against immunity, against all prosecution for him and his family. There we are. I'm not saying that will happen, but that's some food for thought. Gentlemen, thank you very much. To all of you who've listened, thank you. It's really, really appreciated. And also, can you please, we are a little concerned in that we're still not getting enough people looking at our Inner Sanctum videos. And my being away for a week in Italy, or 5 days in Italy, hasn't really helped particularly in getting more videos out. So more will come out this coming week. And I will chase up these interviews, because we really do need these interviews. But the question for you guys is, do we put those interviews for the Inner Sanctum only, or do we make them public to everyone? Because I'm very conscious of the fact you guys are parting with your money, and we have to give you as much value as possible, which is why I'm downloading so many courses and ebooks and so forth. But certainly give us some guidance. Either send us an email, illuminatisilver@gmail.com, or info@illuminatisilver.com, to sort of guide us as to what it is that you're looking for. I have asked 2 designers to design our silver ingots, and I'm hoping, although I was hoping that would happen 2 weeks ago, but I'm hoping that we'll have some progress there. And we'll certainly have some interviews planned without any question. And Greg, your contact, the one man and his dog, I believe you're speaking to him this week, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Try and nail him down to a date. But he is all over the country.
Yes. And Tata Vabindu says, I think you need more public content to bring people in. And yes, Mario, I have written to him. I haven't had a response, but I will. I have got an alternative way of reaching him now. So on Monday, he will be my priority. And I'm seriously hoping we can get David Morgan. We did have approaches a year ago. We actually turned that down, believe it or not, a year ago. I think for the simple reason, not directed from David, but from a close associate of his. We turned it down on the grounds that at the time, we didn't feel we had enough people interested in following it, because I didn't want to waste his time. But certainly now we have the Inner Sanctum going, we're going to up our game on that. Greg, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Marcus,
sorry if we've bored everybody, Richard, with Brexit.
We've gone well over time. We apologise for that. And Marcus, I hope you will join us again shortly.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And everyone, thank you. And a public release. Good night.
Good night and good morning all.
Yes, good morning or good night. And of course, on our next one, unless we change the date, but it looks like everyone's agreed, will be Saturday the 4th of May.
Cheerio.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.